So I'd start by this way. So let me quickly say some things. M&E is a new, so I'll just proceed on some points just for us to, M&E is starting to become much popular, like an emerging field in the last 2 decades. That is one. Number two, the field of M&E is growing as we're seeing globalization also growing as well. Three is that there are recent shifts to country-led evaluations. So I wanted to proceed on those 3 points. And based on that, I'll go from prehistory till the 2020s. So what we know during the prehistory times, I mean, before the woodblock printing, before you have your Gutenberg printer, Egyptians do have slaves. Our great-great-great-great-grandmothers, grandfathers, they do have farmlands, grains, crops, animals. And I mean, because Africa is the cradle of civilization, that is where the first man came from. So we say that monitoring and evaluation started way back prehistory, actually in Africa. Yes, and some of the approaches you will see in, so I actually factored these 2 books, very important books for me. You can check it out on Amazon, buy it. Cloneshouse has it in his library anyway. So it's the African origin of civilization and how slavery started in Lagos before the colonial era. So, so then, I mean, owners of slaves used to count their slaves, also look at the number of times they've used in the field, on the farmlands. They also count the number of grains that they have in their barns and silos, also the number of animals that they have. So we say that even prehistory, which is the first during when we were hunter-gathering, monitoring and evaluation started then, and is one of the things that there's a new movement now on Made in Africa, which I will talk to us about later on in the history of M&E. So please, I'll be using history of M&E and history of evaluation interchangeably, because also, I mean, so permit me to do that. So I might use history of evaluation or history of M&E. So, so that was when M&E started, and we used to say that whether we like it or not, we have actually used an approach of M&E before, even in our households, in your kitchen, within your family. You've tried doing that. But if we want to define the evaluation that we do, the monitoring evaluation, we say it is then kind of systematic, right? So there's a system that has been built on that. So in the prehistory times, you had Africans, Egyptians, you that you're looking at me and listening to me. Our great-great-grandfathers have done monitoring and evaluation in the past. Then came the 1930s, typically known for when the steel machineries, cars became a thing of innovation in the United States. So what United States was doing was starting to conduct some kind of monitoring and evaluation, especially for their public funded programs like water facilities, construction of bridges. So then it used to be people monitoring for compliance, right? Just making sure that yes, every bit of measurement that was measured to provide a water facility is meets that specification. So things related to input kind of monitoring emerged then in the 1930s. Then came the 1940s, and I'm sure some of us that are history students here, maybe there are a few of us. If you're an history student, if you studied history before, please type 1. in the chat box. Type 1 if you are a history student, like you've done history before, and maybe at your high school, maybe in the university, you focused on history. Please type 1 in the chat box, so that we can even check if we have some history students here. Anyways, the 1940s to the 1950s, every one of us know what happened. The Second World War was between 1939 and 1945. During this time, the United States were actually measuring. In fact, they were using health officials to monitor the health of soldiers that were sent to war then, those fighting in Europe, in Asia. They were monitoring their conditions just to make sure, yes, their health is fine and good. That is one point of monitoring and evaluation during that session. So why 1945, 1940, 1945? So the war ended in 1945. 1945 is a peculiar year for monitoring and evaluation because that was when the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, which was called the, I think, International Development Bank for Reconstruction, because it was meant to reconstruct. These institutions were meant to reconstruct all the countries that were shattered by the war, especially Europe back then. So came the Marshall Plan by Harry Truman, who was the president of the United States. He was the one that signed the Marshall Plan for providing aid to the Europeans. And I mean, this was the one of the first places where the physical kind of aid money transaction started. I'm not going to talk about because if you in the history of international development, you will see that aid started from colonization, actually. So colonization was actually a form of providing aid to some countries. But so I'm not going to talk about that. So that is a discussion for another time. So the Marshall Plan started, yes, the flow of aid to Europe. And one other significant thing was the creation of the European Economic Cooperation, which later you will see turned into, which was actually the OECD. Which are the 18 countries then? So they were the ones managing the funds in Europe, trying to reconstruct Europe. And I mean, it also led to NATO, which I'm not going to talk about. Please, if you have questions, punch it in the chat box as I'm going on, because we won't take questions. Within then, we have the 1960s, where you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is very important for evaluation because this act laid the foundation. This act was a United States act. To be frank, United States had some of the laws that aided monitoring and evaluation, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is one of them, in which the federal government started providing funds to secondary basic education in states in the United States. They created a system, a standardized system for measuring the performance of schools in the United States. So that's a critical point in the life of the monitoring and evaluation. Also, there was the planning, programming, and budgeting system of 1969 of the US. This particular policy, so you can't just budget. So you have to budget based on planning, based on programming, then you then budget based on that. You budget based on, so there is now evaluation of the past budget. So you can only plan for a program after evaluation has done in the US. So these two laid a very huge background for evaluation in the US. So like I said, during the 1960s, in fact, I think 1960, or that was when you then have the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a huge body. I mean, the OECD before then, OEEC turned into OECD because it was no more European countries. You now have Canada, US, Japan joining this body. This is another key point in the lifetime of evaluation, because it was with the OECD that the Development Assistance Committee, which you will see later, developed a criteria for conducting evaluation all around the world. So the OECD set up the Development Assistance Committee in 1961. And I mean, also in the 1960s, you and I that are here because I see so many other African, I mean, it was the time for African liberation. I actually put it in quotes because yes, we say it's liberation, but I mean, that is a conversation for another time. It was also during this period that conversation started about multilateral versus bilateral. So aid from the UN, IMF, aids, which could be loans or grants. There were actually conversations in Europe, even before it came to Africa, about those funds that came from IMF or USA or US. Like, what is its effect? Is it actually doing what it's meant to be doing? So this led to the creation of bilateral agencies, actually, and we saw the first aid agency of a nation state, which is France. Then you saw USAID, then CEDA started. So it gave way for so many national agencies. And I mean, it was during the 1960s. So just to have an idea of how Africa has also come along was when, yes, a whole lot of African countries actually got independence. Actually, 35 African countries got independent during the 1960s. Something to chew on. And it came to the 1970s where you had the financial crisis, oil shortages, the Iran revolution, which caused, I mean, Iran is a big power in terms of oil production, which led to, yes, shortage in oil market, led to financial crises in Europe. But I mean, it was not the same case for some countries in Africa. In history, I mean, what comes to our face is actually the financial crisis in the 1970s, but actually there were some countries doing well in Africa, which included Nigeria actually in the 1970s. Unfortunately, the economy was booming and all, and there were so many activities. But I mean, there was that question about what is the cost benefit on getting aid from some countries to European countries. It also came up again in the 1970s. And I think that led to a whole lot of development evaluation agencies also in Europe as well, and more bilateral organizations across Asia also as well. And one significant thing in 1970 was also the Joint Committee on Standards for Education Evaluation. So the US institutionalized education evaluation. Everything about evaluation, about education is being evaluated in the US, and it forms a huge background, especially for the first National Association for Evaluation, which we will see later on. Then came the 80s, when the World Bank shifted to structural adjustment programs, not only the World Bank, but also IMF, I mean, some of the international financial institutions, or the ones you know as the United Nations. So, but one significant, I mean, so this was what I was talking about, that yes, the US actually was the first country to form a country-based evaluation association, which was the American Evaluation Association in 1986. It was not, so you would think that AEA is just an American evaluation association. It had members from over 70 countries of the world, even up till now. And I'm very sure maybe that numbers would have increased. It was also functioning for Canada, so like a North American bloc kind of association. Then on the other side in Africa was, yes, the reign of military governments, mostly that you see in Africa, then also benefiting from the structural adjustment program of the World Bank, which I mean, a little bit controversial, but we won't go to all that. 1990s, yes. For some people that grew up in the 90s, yes, it used to be called the naughty 90s. Gave rise to, yes, more nationalists, because it was just by the 1990s you saw the fall of the communism in Eastern Europe, in the European blocs, the Soviet Union. But I mean, in terms of evaluation, 1991 became a popular time in the history of evaluation because the first DAC criteria was published, which had relevance, efficiency, sustainability, impacts, and effectiveness. So then it's 5 criteria. Then also an important part was that the government of US actually passed an act of the parliament, which said that every government intervention needs to be evaluated. And you know, I mean, for you to have American Association of Evaluation at first in the previous decade, it means that, yes, there's a profession already, there's a guidance for that profession already, so they conduct those evaluations. It also led to, yes, the creation of the UK Evaluation Society, the German Evaluation, and later on in that decade, for the African Evaluation Association. Then, and I mean, much of evaluation was focused on government entities, like making sure, yes, government programs have been done, or to measure it in terms of the criteria. Then came the 2000s, the decade of the Millennium Development Goals. The 2000s formed another important decade for evaluation, even though there had been a DAC criteria in the previous decade. The Monterey Consensus, which was, I mean, a conference of, I think about 50 head of states and foreign ministries came together. And it was at this Monterey Consensus that it was agreed that some developed countries should shed 0.7% of their gross national income and send it to developing countries. So that was the agreement then. So for example, the United Kingdom needs to take out of its own country income 0.7% of that income and send it to different developing countries. That was the consensus. That was what the consensus, and so many other things. Facilitating trade and all amongst countries were part of it. But I think most importantly was the 0.7% gross national income that needs to go to developing countries. It then formed a benchmark, a yardstick for another kind of evaluating those developed countries. One yardstick was trying to measure if those countries are actually doing 0.7% of their gross national income. There's only a few countries that are doing it, actually. I think the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, not the US, not the UK, even though the US does a larger amount, but it is not up to the 0.7% of the gross national income. Then came, I mean, afterwards, the Monterey, there's been so many declarations on aid. So aid facilitated evaluation. And I mean, the institutionalization of aid in the global system facilitated evaluation. And I mean, you saw the International Organization for Cooperation in Evaluation started there in that same decade. You saw the ideas came into play. That is the International Development Evaluation Association. And I mean, European Union became a huge place for evaluation because, I mean, once you start doing 0.7% or not up to, then you want to be able to tell your citizens, because don't forget that 0.7% of the country aid is actually, maybe we would say from tax, the citizen tax. So they need to be able to tell their citizens, like, this is the impact of the amount of money we're putting into developed countries. So I mean, this also led to some kind of theory-based approaches, which means, yes, you need a theory of change, of what change should look like. Evaluation started focusing on that. Then came the 2010. I mean, after the MDGs And in looking at the MDGs was that, oh, you know, our fault with the MDGs, even though we made progress, even though China took about 800 million people out of poverty. China was actually big on taking out poverty, but maybe, so, yeah, I mean, we saw some progress, but not that much with MDGs for other countries. But after looking at it was that, oh, we didn't do proper evaluation. We didn't monitor all the interventions within the MDG. So the SDG came and there was that huge thing about evaluation that every country must do evaluation, must do monitoring and evaluation of its SDG intervention. So that led to another kind of emphasis on evaluation. In fact, there was a eval agenda. In fact, there was, I think in 2016, or I can't remember now, it was the year of evaluation. So because yes, everybody had to, every country that are signed up to the SDGs, that is doing one or two things as a consensus SDGs, needed to do evaluation. And they actually submit this as, they call it VNR or something, like every year. So you actually submit, if you're working on health, if you're working on it, so you needed to submit that. This particular decade also led to the Development Assistance Committee looking at the criteria. It was during this decade that we then have new criteria. Coherence became, coherence was added to the number of criteria that we had on the dark criteria. So, I mean, that also made it like, yes, for us to be able to evaluate properly the SDGs, we need to look at the criteria we're using. And that was where the updated DIE criteria was published. Also during this decade, there's so much conversation about even the use of the evaluation that was done the decade before. So you can think about bilateral evaluation, which is a huge portfolio actually, and also multilateral agencies evaluation, which has been done in the past decade. There were conversations among professional associations about who is using it. Are these bilateral agencies using it? Even though there are few governments that nationally have an M&E system that allows them to look at evaluation. The conversation was about bilateral and multilateral agencies, like how they use evaluation, some of the evaluations that have been done, not being used. And the later part of that decade led to conversations on Made in Africa evaluation, because the previous decade came the African Evaluation Association. Made in Africa became something popular amongst the African Evaluation Association, especially some people. Yeah, there were some researchers who focused on Made in, so which is like an indigenous kind of evaluation, not using the same kind of approach that is used in the West. And conversations like, yes, there are something called indigenous knowledge, how we can know that things are improving or not. The discussion about using quantitative method versus qualitative, for example, using your administering questionnaires versus interviewing people, speaking to people. I mean, there were so many conversations on this. And I mean, you know, with the SDGs, since countries need to develop evaluation protocols for any of the SDGs they are focused on, then the conversation shifted to that, do countries even know how to conduct evaluation? Because most countries, evaluation is done in their country by development partners, which could be multilateral agencies or bilateral agencies. So the conversations then shifted to countries being able to develop their own evaluation capacity. Then, before you know it, the pandemic struck, and the conversation shifted to how do we do things newly in a way that we would not hurt ourselves. It shifted to us thinking about technology in evaluation more than before, even though, yeah, I mean, it has started in the decade previously with the rise of technology. I mean, but 2020 with the pandemic gave a shift to how do we do evaluation, for example, without seeing people, using technology. And I mean, there's so many tech tools at the moment, Biamo, a whole lot of them, mobile forms, that is being used at the moment to conduct, to carry out data collection, for example, analysis and all that. So there's still currently so much talks about how we do evaluation. What are the innovations that one can build on top M&E that wouldn't be like what we used to do before. Also, there is a conversation around if we really want countries to have evaluation capacities, then we need institutions that can provide that within those countries. And that can not only provide it, but that can contextualize it as well. And I mean, that led to some bilateral agencies, foundations, looking towards in-country institutions that can provide such capacity building to their countries. And I mean, that's where Cloneshouse stays. And also looking at communities that can provide such capacities to people, to individuals. And when we say capacity building, it's not just this one-day training, two-day training. So we're talking about a long-term kind of relationship with the trainees or with the students in conducting evaluation. So these are recent conversations that are happening in 2020s around evaluation, and I mean, we hope to see more of that. And I think on that note, I've tried, I mean, you cannot flash through the history of evaluation just like that. There's so many things to it, but I mean, we'll try to do justice to it. These are some references. There's a particular book that I recommend, Road to Results, very important.